This is Puzzle, Problem, Mess. Conversations about the media economy and how to think clearly when things get messy. In this episode, I'm joined by Gerald Ashley. Gerald is based in London and is an expert in business risk, behavioural economics, and decision making, with a particular focus on how people actually make decisions under uncertainty. He's written 3 books on decision making, financial speculation, and how businesses evolve and innovate. In fact, this podcast takes its name from a previous conversation that I came across in which Gerald explored the puzzle, problem, mess framework. So it's only fitting that Gerald is the first guest and to introduce the ideas of puzzles, problems, and messes. Here's Gerald Ashley. Hello, Gerald. Welcome on what I gather is a very cold January morning in London.
Indeed it is, Dan. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
You and I have been discussing that the broader media industry is becoming increasingly complex, and for media executives and teams, it's getting harder to pin down how to best tackle a particular challenge or opportunity. There are myriad overlapping dynamics at play, be that technology, consumer, competitive dynamics, and there's pressure to act decisively, and it's become a real mess, and it's a tough environment for people. Now, in the 70s, a management professor by the name of Russell Ackoff developed a problem-solving approach for dealing with messes based on categorizing particular challenges into puzzles, problems, or messes. And I know you're familiar with Ackoff's thinking and also strategy formulation generally. How do you think we should best understand Ackoff's puzzle, problem, mess framework?
I wonder if we might start with the overall universe of life itself, if you like, which is that out there now and in the future, there is always an element of uncertainty. Let's get the certainty bit out of the way, first of all. There are some things that are certain: sunrise, sunset, tide tables, and they aren't totally 100% certain, but unless the sun explodes, they're kind of pretty much predictable. So we could know what the sunrise is in London in 100 years' time or in 500 years' time. Now, that is very appealing to the sort of human mind, because I think we are very much geared towards the idea of locking down certainty and things we feel comfortable with. I think all intelligent people realize you can't lock things down entirely, but there's a mainspring or an internal desire to put a framework around things, and to put a framework around, let's call it an issue. It could be sales revenue, it could be managing a local government organization, being a doctor, lawyer, whatever. But we're all faced with the fact that there will be elements of uncertainty in our life and in our working career. And we seek to try and put a framework around that. And with that framework, we try to contain it so that we can so-called solve it. So to answer your question about puzzles, problems, and messes, if you think about what we're doing, the outside world, in many ways, is quite messy. There's a lot of uncertainties about things. And the human desire is to put a framework around it and contain a certain element of it, cut a slice off, if you like, turn it into a so-called puzzle, solve the puzzle, and then say, look how clever I am, I've done it. So if we look at the universe of those 3 elements, what messes are, if we start with messes, is there's no clear answer. In fact, there's no clear question, because it's in the future. There are so many variables of differing volatility and likelihood that incredibly difficult to nail everything down. Now, in the middle, we have something called problems, or what Ackoff calls problems. And this is where you take a subset of that, but that you can have defined questions, but not defined answers. So, for example, you and I look at the cost of flying from London to Sydney, and there will be a variety of prices depending on which class you go, which airline you go with, which time of day, blah, blah, blah. There isn't a definitive answer because your question might be what is the cheapest or what is the fastest or what is the most luxurious, whatever. But with a problem, you've got a choice of different options you can use. And let's take another example, something like pension fund management. So if you're running your own personal pension or savings account, should you be in bonds? Should you be in equities? Should you be in real estate? Should you just blow the lot and not worry about your kids? There are a variety of ways you can do it. And then within that subset, there are puzzles. Now, puzzles, you can get a very definitive answer if you ask a very, very definitive question. So find me the cheapest flight from London to Sydney and go, you use a search engine or some form of agency, either an individual or increasingly a computer program these days. They find you the ticket and you're done. To wrap all this up into a thought, a lot of things are a mess. There's a tendency to try and turn those into problems with different potential options. Pick one and then so-called solve it and high-five everybody that you've dealt with the issue. This comes up a lot in politics. So politicians, I don't know so much about Australia, but in the UK, transport policy has been a complete mess since the Second World War. There are various lobbies between rail and road and public transport, less so airlines because we're a small country. And these lobbyists aggressively lobby politicians who almost invariably cut things down to a puzzle, a so-called policy, and then announce that they've solved the overall issue. They haven't, and there's a lot of waste and inefficiency in this approach, and there's also a lot of false starts.
And as an executive, is it easy or difficult to know where the boundary between a problem and a mess is, or between a puzzle and a problem?
I think it can be a bit difficult because I think we essentially don't look at messes. We kind of think, oh, let's sweep that under the carpet. Oh, it's a problem. And we've got option A, B, or C. B looks good. Let's hone in on that and then turn it into a puzzle. Some people call this management by spreadsheet. So you can get a puzzle into a perfect spreadsheet dead easily. Problems less so because you've got optionality. Do you do A, B, C, D, whatever it may be? But there are plenty of management tools there. Scenario planning is one of the most obvious ones. When it comes to looking at messes, I think most people say, that's not really my area I need to worry about. I need to focus on that dreaded word, solutions. You see, we all want solutions. The big boss says, give me the solution. You and I, as consumers, we buy solutions all the time. Oh, look, it's a better carpet cleaner or whatever it may be. And humans actually have I don't know, almost like a stock exchange in solutions. We buy and sell solutions to one another all the time. Oh, this washing machine is guaranteed for 3 years, whatever it may be. And many businesses have the term solution in their corporate title. You'll meet a lot of people, and this is not to denigrate them anyway, but you will meet a lot of people who are management of whatever solutions department because it sells. It may not be correct, or it may only be limited because you're only looking at a partial universe of what's going on, but we really lock onto that.
There's a quote often attributed to Ackoff that goes something like, in a mess, prediction is a form of self-deception. And you know, and I know, that the managerial and strategic currency of large media companies is predictive planning. It's 3 to 5 year strategies, budgets, targets, operating plans. But Akoff's view was that these managerial techniques have their limitations in a messy competitive environment, for example. What's your view on this? And what do you think the best role is for predictive planning in messy environments?
Yeah, well, that's a nice, easy question, isn't it? I think the issue is one of recognition. Recognize you can't know everything, you can't nail everything down. You may have a perfect solution to something, and somebody comes up with a better solution, and so your solution doesn't turn out to be as watertight as you thought it was. I think a lot of it is to do with mindset of how management is run. A name for listeners to go and look up and think about is a guy called Jules Goddard, who I now think is retired, but was a very senior academic at London Business School. And he wrote a book called Uncommon Sense Stroke Common Sense. And this was the idea that often the case that mavericks will produce better results over time than people who just stay in the very narrow guidelines of the industry or the firm they're working for. Now, it's easy to say that if your career's not at risk, because if your career is at risk, you're going to stick to the rules. And maybe he has the academic freedom to suggest otherwise, but he has written two or three very interesting and quite entertaining books on this topic. Another area to look at is if you look at a company in manufacturing, is somebody like 3M. 3M, who are now very famous for the Post-it note, but they produce endless sort of patents and designs all the time. And they treat it as a portfolio, and they chop ones that don't work, and they constantly look for new ones. And that feeds back into Goddard's idea that companies can get into a closed loop where they have metrics and measurement, and they don't look out of that loop. It's difficult for organizations to do that because it's expensive. It's expensive in terms of time and money. A great example for people to look up is Skunk Works. The Skunk Works was developed in the 1940s, and essentially, this is an idea where you take a lump of people or group of people out of your mainstream organization and you put them to one side, and a phrase I'm not wildly happy with, but do some blue sky thinking, or that other dreaded cliche, thinking outside the box, all that stuff. Oh, let's add another one, being ahead of the curve. This is all management speak. I should be taken out and shot for using these phrases. But the point about the skunk work was that you have people outside running the main business, trying to look for new developments. So actually looking into the mess, if you like, and seeing what could develop. Now, there was a problem with this. The problem is a lot of people do not want to be put into one of those groups. A, because they feel a bit exposed. What if they spend a year going around and discovering or developing nothing, and at the end all they come up with is a square wheel? And then they worry about their careers because they then, they're out of the mainstream, they've got to get back in, and they may be tarred with the brush of failure. Now, the key insight is that you guarantee anybody who's selected to go into that group has a promotion when they come back to the main group. So they actually get rewarded. Now, some people can say, oh, so look, you spent a year doing nothing, you just got a promotion. Well, no, you can make it a much more tight and organized thing than that. So I think, in a way, there's nothing new in life. Skunk Works goes back to the 1940s development of the planes in the United States. Jules Goddard wrote great stuff from the 1960s onwards. In fact, I think he was an early advisor to David Ogilvy. So he's got quite a background. And it's about trying to be open, but recognizing, and this is where it has to be shareholders and very senior management are willing to take the risk of failure, not to bet the entire firm, but maybe you put a small percentage of management time and effort and money into developing new things. Lots of firms just won't take that risk. And in a funny sort of way, I think that puts them at risk.
Mm. Yeah, and great examples on 3M, and I think it's Lockheed Martin had the Skunk Works program, didn't they?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And, the majority of media companies, the people that might listen to this might be media companies that, for perhaps good reasons, aren't able to do a Skunk Works type spin-off or don't have the culture and the heritage of innovation that 3M had. If you're an executive in a traditional media company that's been around for a while, and it's because of its public reporting responsibilities, it's got a very strong culture of predictive modeling and forecasting, how would you try and introduce some of these more iterative styles of thinking?
I think it's about mindset. What you mustn't do is just completely upend the company and sort of scrap things and start again. Sometimes quite large companies have done this, and have in one notable occasion, General Electric, the UK version, GEC, went from being the largest company in the UK, or certainly in the top 2 or 3, to essentially going bust because it just abandoned all its usual way of managing things and markets, and basically put everything into what was a dot-com boom, and it went bust. So I think at the individual level, I think it's about just learning to have a different mindset. I mean, I was well into my 40s before I got out of the tram lines of thinking of how do we solve the puzzle and just trying to widen it. And I think as soon as you do that, that has some form of effect in your day-to-day work. At the very senior management levels, I think, in a way, that's a large part of their day job. I know there's this cult of the CEO is sort of the guiding light who makes all the decisions at the top. But surely the most beneficial thing board-level management can do is to think in different ways and explore different areas and get used to failure. This is the other thing about certainty. You see, we all like certainty in solutions because it's not going to fail, is it? So, why should we change something? It may not fail immediately, but you may be on a slow declining track over time. The world around you moves even if you don't.
Great. And what do you think the cost is organizationally or culturally of misclassifying a mess as a puzzle or a problem as a puzzle?
Potentially very huge. But again, it may well be a slow burn. So if you're meeting quarterly targets in a big corporation, or even annual targets, it may not initially show through. But there are new developments, there are new industries, there are new techniques. One of the sort of classical management ways to sort of at least try to address this is to look at scenario planning. Scenarios go all the way back to just after the war, 1950s. Basically, Shell, the big oil company, they employed a very sharp guy called Arie de Geus. He's written a number of books on the topic. I'm not certain he's still alive now. He'd be pretty ancient. But he is still very much the sort of person to go to look at scenarios. And scenarios just do make you think a little differently. They can be a dead end if you don't do it properly or you don't think it through enough. And just creating the scenario doesn't actually do anything. It's how you implement it. One incredibly simple little rule of thumb is never have 3 scenarios, because believe it or not, a group of people will cluster towards the middle one. And this is a little bit like a magic trick. When the magician says you've got to find a lady or would pick a particular card. Well, if you're very manipulative, you put options either side of your preferred option and people go for the one you want, whether that's sensible or barking mad. So a way around that is to make certain that you have a group of 4 scenarios. So somebody has to jump one way or the other. In totally unrelated thing, I was in Vietnam last year, and Vietnam is like a mini version of China, and it's a very free market economy, but politics is absolutely under the iron control of the Communist Party, to the extent that hardly anybody seems to know who's actually running Vietnam. So when I got back, I sort of had a look at how does the government work. And they have a group of 4 generals. Inevitably, they are generals. But again, 4, much better number than 3. Because again, the problem you're going to have there is 2 versus 1, and 1 gets seriously cheesed off and, maybe it's a counter-revolution or who knows what. But with 4, you're either going to split down the middle, and so you're going to have to rethink the whole issue, or 3-1 is a much more solid majority. Now, these things seem trivial in a way, but all the time they're forcing us to address the things that we can't or don't understand. Some things will remain, misunderstood or beyond our immediate knowledge, but at least look at that rather than just tinker around with models that are playing with no known certainties all the time.
Now, you and I started our careers when there was arguably more certainty and predictability than there is for people starting careers today. What advice would you have for someone early in their career at this particularly messy time? And what advantages do you think younger professionals have?
Well, you're right. I mean, for my sins, I actually started in the 1970s, which, as a younger relative pointed out to me, was the last century. And that's a comment I haven't quite recovered from yet. And it was a very formulaic sort of world. You got a decent education, or you did professional exams, and you got on a fairly stable sort of career path. And people who changed jobs or changed firms were sometimes viewed with suspicion. You may move once. If you've moved 3 times, what's the hell the matter with you? Are you the right sort of employee, or are you incompetent, or whatever? That's completely, in a way, if you think about it, was a closed world. We had much less access to information in any other area. So I was in international banking. Did I know anything about manufacturing, advertising, media, medicine? No. I got to know a fair bit about medicine because of other relatives, but we lived in a very closed world. Now we live in a very open world, and you might say it's almost overly open because there's such access to information and knowledge. And maybe if we're not careful, we misunderstand it or misinterpret it. But what it does do is it informs you about your own area. So I think it's really important to look at other industry sectors, or could even be government sectors, to see how they do things and what you can learn. And, you should think, can you learn from their mistakes? I certainly learned that in my days in banking, that when I then took up doing advisory work, I found that the clients often knew a lot more about risk than I did, particularly in things like aerospace, because in banking, all you can do is lose money, whereas in aerospace, if the plane falls out of the sky, it's incredibly serious. And the same with pharmaceuticals. So there are always very bright people you can learn of. And that comes again back to this whole thing of Jules Goddard and Lockheed Martin and the mindset of being open. It's an open world out there, so you have to be open as well. You can't control the game. And I'll come to one last point on this, which is that my heart sinks when I go to a strategy meeting or presentation, and on the PowerPoint it has chessmen, and you think this is a nice sort of mindset of we're playing a deep game of chess here, and we've got to be really careful we know what we're doing. Well, chess is completely unlike life and business. You and I are playing chess. There's a defined board of 64 squares. There's these defined pieces, and they can only move in certain directions, and it's all completely rule-based. You move, I move, ping pong, backwards. Life's not like that at all. It may be that you look at your business as chess, or you look at your career as chess, and think, I've just got to make this move, I've just got to do that. Well, there may be somebody the other side of the world who, whilst you're making one move, makes five and just runs away with something. And so if I have any message today, it's about openness to new ideas and learning from people in other disciplines. There's lots to be learned from risk in things like surgery, for example, or as I spoke earlier about aerospace. A lot of the formulas and a lot of the mindset is very similar to finance, but sometimes it's more sophisticated or people have come up with good ideas. So I suppose the younger generations these days, and I think this applies still to me, is like it or not, life has turned into much more of a long-term learning experience. Now, I know that can be, again, one of these trite management phrases, but the fact of the matter is there is loads to learn and there's loads to apply. And so that can be a positive message rather than freezing in front of uncertainty.
Gerald Ashley, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Very appreciative.
Dan, been a great pleasure. Thank you.
That was Gerald Ashley. Thanks for listening. I'm Dan Fay. Original music by Lee Rosevere and So Cow. And if you think a colleague or friend would enjoy this episode, please pass it on.